Hey, I'm Rob Taylor. I'm a visual artist, writer, and general maker of things. And in this video, I want to look at the finishing process I'm using on the BR85 prop. Originally, I wasn't planning on doing any video content for this build. I just wanted to focus on it and get it done, because it is taking quite a long time. But I've kind of honed the process of finishing over the last few parts that I've done. I just wanted to get that down on video so that my useless memory would be able to retain it later on, and figured it may be useful for someone else out there. So, video it is. Now, what I'm looking at is taking something like this, which is basically raw, finished, construction complete, but no real finishing work. This has had the coat of primer, but that's all. And taking that to a final stage via incremental steps. First is this stage, where the holes are generally filled. You can't see too many. There's a couple of dips here and there, but generally speaking, the surface finish looks pretty good. And then from there, you come to this stage where everything's nice and smooth. There are no strange dips and valleys, and this is almost ready for its final coat of primer. I just need to get the plate on the back to allow it to lock more positively into the stock. From there, I go on to the dark primer, which it gets 2 coats of. And this has had its first coat and sanding, so it's ready for its second coat of dark primer. If I move out the way a bit, there we go. It's nice and metallic. Between those two steps, I move up from around 320, 400 grit, around there, to more like 1000 grit. And just before I put the gloss coat on, I go over it with 2000 grit, because I did an A/B test, and the clear coat over the 2000 grit was definitely smoother than the clear coat over the 1000 grit. For some reason, it didn't seem to me like it should make a difference, but there you go. I guess I'll take a look at that later in the video when we get to that kind of stage. But once the clear coat is on, there's another 2 coats of clear coat, each with 2000 grit between them. I was originally going to sand the outside of this 2000 grit and then go over it with Pledge acrylic floor sealer, but I'm not sure if anything in that inhibits the silicone, and I don't think it really needs it. So I'm just going to leave it. But yeah, that's the foregrip, obviously. And that's the final appearance. I've also completed the barrel, almost. The core needs filling. I was originally just going to leave it like that and figure out some kind of mechanical retainer for the silicone plug, but I think I'm just going to fill it up because it'll be a lot easier. And once it's painted matte black inside, no one's really going to be able to see anyway. So there's no real advantage to maintaining that very slight accuracy increase. So yeah, I'm going to go through all of those steps and discuss at each point what I've learned along the way, and cover it in as much detail as possible. The first part will be the filling, the part that takes us from this stage, see these knobbles here and there all over, to this stage. This is about 3 hours in, 3.5 hours in, something like that. and it's at a point where it's pretty close to being done. The only thing that needs working on now is if there are any dimples, which there aren't. There may be a couple slightly rougher spots that need a nice little thumb of filler in. The filler I'm using is Bondo air dry putty because it's much easier to use than regular Bondo for this kind of purpose. And as long as you keep it thin, it dries very quickly. So yeah, that's the first step. That'll obviously be a time lapse because I can't do 3.5 hours in regular speed. And then we'll go through the other points step by step. Filling, sanding, and the primer coats, and then finally the clear coat. So yeah, let's get into that. Kind of hard to exactly describe the process of filling without really slowing it down and taking it step by step. Here I'm mostly trying to smooth out. There are some bits like that big line down the middle, and the area around the little circular bit that there's actual filling trying to take place and shaping. But for the most part, it's just trying to smooth slightly knobbly bits. Okay, so that was about 35 minutes, I think, give or take, based on the number of frames in the time lapse. That ended up. So that was about 35 minutes, I think, given the number of frames in the time lapse. Not bad in comparison to the first side, though I think there was a little less work to do here. It's now looking like this. Pretty good. You can see a bit of sheen right there. Next up is to hit this with auto primer, which I have heating up in a water bath in the paint room, and see what it's looking like. Whether I need to go over the whole thing again with another round of filler putty, or if I can just get away with a quick single coat of filler primer. We'll see in about 25 minutes when it's dry. I also let the putty itself dry for about 25 minutes, so it's been a while. Alright then, got the stock back from the paint room right here. It's looking better than it was. There are some parts, like along the top here, that are actually still in need of filing. Not necessarily yet filling. We'll see how those bits look once I've knocked them back a bit with the needle files. The actual surface itself is looking a lot better than it was. Some parts are going to need just a little bit of filler primer, other parts still could use some putty. But overall it's probably looking at about 70 or 80% done. So making good progress. And yeah, first I'm going to wet sand it to 320 grit in order to knock back some of this overfilling. Slight bit right there. And taking that over the whole surface will make it nice and glossy, which means that there's nowhere for those little nooks and crannies to hide. So we'll know exactly what we're looking at filling wise. I choose to do wet sanding because it's an inherent limitation of using spray paints, really. They say you can wet sand within about 15 minutes or so, but if you want to dry sand, you have to wait like 4 hours, I think it says on the back of the can, which is kind of crazy. I don't have time for that. Plus, of course, the inherent positives of wet sanding itself. You know, your sandpaper lasts a lot longer because you're using the water to carry the particles rather than the gaps in between the grains. I don't know that necessarily switching from pure water to a water dish soap mix has particularly changed anything. You're supposed to use soap in there. I never really looked into why. Everyone says that's what you're supposed to do, but I haven't really noticed any great difference, personally. Maybe it's just designed to degrease it at the same time. That would make sense. You'd think bevels like these would be really easy to sand, but with all the little bits sticking out here and there, it's surprisingly difficult. This is the second 45 minutes of filling. There was another secret 20 minutes at some point, which was never on camera because it was just a spur of the moment thing. I saw some bits to do and just did it. Again, that line down the middle constantly needs fixing and refixing, and I'm always trying to perfect that the curve on the heel in there. That little bit around the circle that I started at the beginning was trying to really sharpen up the bevel rather than have the little millimeter or so of matte board at the bottom, like a cliff. So the grip is in the paint room with its first coat of dark primer drying right now, so I'm going to do a quick overview of what's going on with this. You may have noticed that the filling time-lapse was slightly faster than normal. That was because it ended up taking the same amount of time. I think my 70 to 80% assessment was slightly overstated. It was probably more like 60, which I only discovered after the wet sanding. That's what the wet sanding is for. But yeah, I mean, at this point it's looking pretty close, and I'm gonna wet sand before and after this next coat of primer, just to make sure that I don't have to paint it too much and lose any detail, because there's some overfilling right in here that I can already see. So knock that down, then prime the whole thing, and then wet sand it all again, and at that point it should be pretty much done. On this particular pod, there's still this front piece right here needs moving forward slightly to mesh into the chamber and thumb cutout area right here properly. It doesn't quite merge together, but I'm not counting that as part of the actual surface prep work. But yeah, this side is, let's see, 90% done. And I can see that because it's still wet sanded. So yeah, that's pretty close. I'm pretty happy with this. So sand, prime, sand, and then at that point I should be looking at being ready to dark prime. Of course I'm not going to, because there's still some actual reconstruction work to do. But yeah, it's going well. I didn't actually notice that the washing machine was going in that video until I got it onto the computer. The trick to applying paint is to actually never press the button while the can is stationary. If you press it after you've already started moving and then release it before the motion comes to an end, then you never give the paint a chance to pool, unless of course you go over the same spot several times, like I'm occasionally still guilty of doing. Okay, so it's a couple days later and I've finished refitting the front of it right in here so that it fits into the chamber and the grip. And then I repaired any damage that I'd done during that process and re-primed some filler primer too, and taking it back to the stage we left it at, where we'd just done the final coat of light primer and wet sanded it down. As you can see, that's the stage we're at now. So I said then that the next stage is dark priming, so that's what I'm going to do now. You might be able to see some slight imperfections in the surface. I'm not going to perfectly fill in all of those because of two reasons. One being that fictionally the body casing of this gun would have been cast rather than purely machined. So as part of the casting process, as it comes out of the mold and it gets ground down, machined into its final flat planes, there would be natural little voids here and there in the surface as a part of the process. And also, practically, the 2 coats of dark primer and the 2 coats of self-leveling Clearcoat will probably take care of much of the rest of that filling in process. So, yeah, let's get on with that. Here's the first coat of dark primer. This was super annoying because that's an old can, and for some reason that spray nozzle just does not want to work properly. No matter how much I clean it, comes out very spotty. Fortunately, between this coat going on and the next coat going on in 5 minutes, I went out to Lowe's and grabbed a new can. Love that heat gun, by the way. It's a fancy DeWalt digital variable heat thing. I don't know. It was like $90. It's not exactly Harbor Freight special, but I love its infinite variability. That's not to say that you can't get away with that $20 job from Harbor Freight. Realistically, I actually only ever use that heat gun at around like 250 to 350 and 550 to 600. It's very rare that I use any other temperature with it. So a regular cheap dual temperature heat gun would do the job just fine for pretty much anything in prop making. Back into the paint room. We're going to use the heat gun to drive off any remaining moisture from wet sanding. Make sure it doesn't get underneath the next coat of primer, because that will probably go acid. quite low at 250 Fahrenheit. And in the old Propmaking over here, I have a brand new can of dark grey primer that I just went out and bought because of the weird sputtering issues that you saw on the last pass. So now it's thoroughly warmed through, it should wipe out a lot cleaner. This is the new can. It was high pressure and it was a nice toasty 100 degrees or so from the water bath, so it came out with a lot more force than I was ready for. I was too used to that old can which didn't like to work. So there were one or two places which didn't quite get a proper coverage, hence why I immediately leapt in with the heat gun to try and sort of keep the puddling in place. I love the way it looks on that second dark coat once it's dried. Before it's sanded, it's only a really rich satin sheen, which is the point that a lot of prop makers actually leave it at for moulding. But I'm a little obsessive on this project. I'm sure I'll calm down later on. At this point, I'm no longer really sanding it down anymore. That was pretty much reserved for the last round of dark primer. Using a different color of primer allows you to see exactly where your layers meet if you wear through one layer into the previous one. I don't usually, given how much sanding I've been doing between every layer, but that's typically what you use two different colors of primer for. I think at this point I'm just using 2000 grit to get it nice and shiny, ready for the Clearcoat. I'm only putting one application of Clearcoat in this video because there's just no reason to see both of them. As we've seen here with the dark primer, you don't really need to see both applications. But I wanted to give a sense of the longevity of this process. It's not quick. But it does come out looking really nice. Although, I think on the next project I may well suck it up and go with styrene over matte board. So we're back in the shop again this morning, and now it's looking like this. I let it dry overnight so that any of the moisture that likes to get in The paper components are in around the edges of the drill hole and soak into the fibers and swell up. Make sure to give it enough time to let those evaporate out and go back to shape. The extra shininess is from the 2000 grit that I took it to. This was the first layer on that. And just got to hit it with the 2 coats of Clearcoat now, and we're done.
The trick to applying Clearcoat is understanding that it's self-leveling. It naturally wants to form a flat, smooth surface. You just have to let it. There's a very fine line, though, between smooth surface and actual puddles, which obviously have the little creases along the sides. The best way to do it is in 2 passes. The first pass is very light, and you allow it to look a little bit pebbly on the surface. And then you come through with a second light pass, and in theory, those droplets should link up with the first droplets and create a single contiguous layer. And it should look essentially like a piece of glass over the surface. Sometimes it might need a third pass, depending on how light your coats are. But you've got to go very carefully.
Alright then, we're done. And this is what the final product looks like, with its near mirror finish. I wet sanded at 2000 grit between the 2 Clearcoat layers. That doesn't really give much of an effect on the appearance, but it definitely makes it feel smoother from a previous test that I did. So my theory is that that should help with the moulding, or specifically demoulding process. I haven't sanded the outside because I haven't done that on any of the others either. It just doesn't seem like it's particularly necessary. It feels fine to me, and I'd rather keep it smooth and sealed according to the self-leveling of the Clearcoat. So I've taken a look at the finishing process on my BR85 build, looking at going from something like this, where there are definite texture and imperfections to work on before it's ready for moulding, but the actual construction work is complete. Taking that to something that looks like this, with the multiple layers of filler putty. First applying in the major dings and dents, cracks, and obvious rough textures. Then using primer to see which parts are remaining, and just iterating on that process until we're happy with the surface finish. And then from there, I've used dark primer to help iron out any final imperfections, and then a second layer of dark primer just for a nice surface finish, before finishing off with 2 consecutive coats of acrylic Clearcoat, gloss clear, to allow for easy demoulding. It shouldn't require mold release. So yeah, that's the end of this video. I hope you've enjoyed it and it's been somewhat informative. This is obviously still my first real build, so there's definite potential for iteration on this process. If I do so, I'll probably do some kind of update video in the future. But being the giant nerd that I am, I researched a lot prior to starting, so I don't think it's going to change much, if any, in the future. It's a lot of work. You may have noticed it takes quite some time to do what's relatively a small piece of the overall build. But that's the difference in the building world between quality levels, the amount of time you're willing to put in. So, yeah, I have a build thread on the 405th if anyone's interested in that. Links in the description below. And if you want to questions, comments, that's Twitter, I guess, Rob Taylor Chase. And yeah, again, hope you found it helpful. Thanks for watching.